And for all we know, we're not anywhere near live. Well, no, you know what? I just saw it pop up. So
There it is.
we're on a little bit of a delay here. That's a little bit different. However, you're right. I didn't even watch Friday's show. Did you get a chance to look back at it yet?
No, Lou, I'd like to imagine that period of our history was basically just best shared in person.
I don't disagree. And I hope every lunatic that's out there that got to witness and or endure Friday's show knows that now we have officially hit rock bottom.
Absolutely. And so you should have a lot of confidence to join us on our daily shows when it can't get any worse than that. Also, about a significant percentage of our normal audience was actually there live and in person. So I feel like they didn't really miss much.
No, our first live studio audience was pretty spectacular. And
bonus content.
as we kind of rush to get started here, it occurred to me that I may or may not have the music ready. Oh, no, here we go. This is, like I said, I thought we hit a low on Friday, but who knows? Should we try to start the show and screw it up this time?
Give it hell, Lou.
Here we go. We kind of did it. Welcome to Hotlou Happy Hour. I am your host, Lou Abramowski, or somewhat financially known as Hotlou.
I have repeatedly voted to fund the police, Mike Franklin.
Well, now that I've screwed up the beginning of the show, we can pretty much guarantee you'll screw up the end, right? Something like that.
One of us always is on tap, Lou, to pick up for the other's embarrassing move.
Yeah, and I'm going to go ahead and try to start my watch party, which I should have done several moments ago. But today we're going to be talking about defunding the police.
Yep.
And
because that's what we're doing in 2020.
Yeah, and there's so much nuance and so many details here that it turns out, lunatics, apologies in advance, a handful of text messages shared between your hosts is not enough prep to set this up, particularly when this is a little bit of a side hustle where we don't make anything.
No, we make. I actually did spend a little bit of time on one element of this, which is kind of a little bit down the decision tree, but kind of to start with the headlines, and if you have it queued up or otherwise I can share the screen. Oh, of course I can't share it.
Yeah, of course not. You'll do that. And what I'm going to say at the outset of this whole thing, as you kind of share your headline here, is that I'm going to urge everybody to go to YouTube and watch John Oliver's episode on Last night, because I think they did an incredibly thorough job kind of talking about it. It was a much longer episode than they normally do. And there's lots of reasons, obviously, why, and we'll get into this here in a moment. And I think Last Week Tonight is, it really fills in the gap where the Daily Show kind of took a little bit of a fall after Jon Stewart left, and, does a really great job mixing in comedy with a very well-researched topic. They generally do a really good job at preempting any sort of resistance to a handful of the things that they are going to talk about. I think it was really, really one-sided what they did, but I thought it was really thorough on that one side. So I'm going to recommend everybody watch that, but I think you're going to kind of talk through this article here.
Yeah, a little bit. And I haven't seen the Last Week Tonight, so I can't speak intelligently about it. But at this point, there's barely a person alive in the United States who hasn't seen the news that Minneapolis' city council over the weekend, more or less one after the next, at least 9 of them, which would be enough to overcome a veto of the mayor, has said they are going to, now this is where the question comes in, disband, defund, ending the Minneapolis Police Department, so on and so forth. And I've seen videos of this exchange going on at a big rally on Saturday where Mayor Frey was then asked if he supported that. And to his credit, he said no. And I don't mean to his credit in order like that I'm taking a position on this, which I would if I took a position on it. I would take the same position he took, but to stand up to the crowd and basically say, no, I don't support that. In fact, here's the quote: "I do not support the full abolition of the police department." After which the crowd went full Game of Thrones and started chanting "Jacob, go home" and "Shame, shame," which is what they chanted in the last season of Game of Thrones to Queen Cersei.
Cersei, yeah.
Nakedly marched from one side to the other, one side of the King's Landing. It's just politics is fully merged with entertainment, and I've made that on the show before. And sometimes that can be good, and sometimes that can be really disgusting. And this, to me, is the latter.
Yeah, and loyal lunatic Kevin Thompson already mentioned this in the comments, because I think one of the struggles with this conversation has been around the wording of defund the police, with the emphasis on the defund part, because
Right.
it's there. I think people are both using it and interpreting it at a wide spectrum of uses. On one hand, I think there's a large contingent that is really in the camp of fully defunding and abolishing the Minneapolis Police Department, along with lots of other municipal police departments. And on the other hand, it's talking about actually just shifting budget to social programs that might actually prevent the socioeconomic disadvantages that actually are causally related to these situations that cause crime, including domestic abuse, theft, violent crime, a handful of these things that have shown that by addressing socioeconomic disadvantage can actually create environments where those crimes don't happen in the first place. And my hope is that most of the people are fitting in that category. And I hope that's what Jacob Frey was really going for before he was drowned out by a handful of protesters putting him down the march of shame, right?
It would be, and I agree with you. And I was going to make the same point that having heard a lot of the comments from council members, there seems to be a spectrum of some who would simply replace policing as we know it with different forms of intervention, which I'll be fascinated to see how that turns out. I know there are models of other cities who have done this. Camden, New Jersey comes to mind as one that I've learned of, and I haven't investigated it in the last 24 hours, but certainly we're not going to see what we've seen in the past where, kind of like small ball is being played, if you will, but in a very poorly thought out message unveiling. They've put a lot of fear into law-abiding Minneapolis residents by and large, and really we've been the laughing stock once again of the national media for 48 hours as people are contemplating a major American city without a police force, which is kind of the unavoidable headline if you don't dig in any deeper to what's being said, or if you just take at face value what's being said.
Yeah, there's I've seen a handful of even people that are probably on the side of the defund police, tweeting out things like making mental note to avoid Minneapolis at all costs until the foreseeable future. And which is so crazy to think of, right? Because everybody that lives in Minneapolis is so proud of the state and Minnesota. I don't know that I've ever met, and this is provincial in itself saying this, but a more provincial type of person than somebody who comes from Minnesota.
And Minneapolis in particular.
Yeah.
But there's some of this that this is an example of where we're speaking two different languages. We're not speaking to each other. We're not even speaking with each other. We're speaking maybe not even at each other. I mean, we're speaking different universes entirely. Yesterday, Minneapolis City Council President Lisa Bender went on CNN and was asked by the host what's going to happen, which, by the way, very reasonable question, which it should be called out when it's CNN. What's going to happen if a resident calls the police in the middle of the night if their home is being robbed. And the president, city council president Bender, said, yes, I hear that out loud and clear from a lot of my neighbors and myself too. And I know that comes from a place of privilege for those of us for whom the system is working. I think we need to step back and imagine what it would be like to already live in that reality. And again, just like the previous point, there's a fair point to be made there that if, although I tend to be on the side of not quite believing that there's an epidemic of honest people that are that terrified that if they call the police because they are being victimized, that they will wind up in a worse position. Like I'm open to hearing those kinds of things. And obviously there's been a pretty prominent example lately, although George Floyd didn't call the police. However, it's like beyond my capacity to reason why you would immediately go to white privilege when you represent, I think, the wealthiest part of town, which the council president does in this case, and B, wouldn't understand why there's a huge, probably, I'd say for sure majority, and maybe even a super majority of people who would not understand that that's an opportunity to sort of just say, nope, all of that's going to be fine. We will have a police force, but those types of things will be taken care of by the police in the same way that they always have been and should be. But what we're talking about is something different and bigger in addition to that. And I'm not trying to put words in her mouth because I don't know if that's what she means. Maybe she means that police is just, because I've heard this said too, that policing is just an outgrowth of slavery and this is all an example of systemic racism, yada, yada.
Yeah, I have a really hard time with that argument in general, that something happened 200 years ago is now fully influencing what's happening here, at the moment. But yeah, I mean, I get where people are coming from that thing, but I couldn't help but notice, by the way, again, one of the ads that was showing up on the screen that you showed was just like so comical. So apologies to all the lunatics who had to see that ad that just showed up. We'll recap it because I know you probably closed the tab like you always do immediately afterwards, didn't you? Yeah, it was pretty funny. But there's a handful of things that I want to point out to like all of this thing, because I think the big question is like, if the police department were abolished and something is inevitably going to go wrong, who are the citizens going to call? And it's just incredibly, it's pretty hard when the police department is supposed to be kind of in a more reactive mode here. Like, what is a citizen supposed to do in this particular case, right? So, there's a friend of the show, somebody who we've mentioned a couple times. He goes by Bueno. He shared a really interesting video that I've been looking up, which is why I've been kind of distracted here as I want to try to show it. It doesn't look like I'm going to be able to, but he kind of went through the handful of less obvious reasons that people call the cops. And of the two examples that I can recall from the top of my head are people call the cops just because they're annoyed at somebody else's behavior. And I want to, before I go on, I want to point out, over the weekend, I found the most fascinating YouTube channel I have seen of late, and it's called Cart Narcs. And I meant to share this with you so you could look at it. But there's this hilarious like morning radio talk show guy who's doing this Cart Narcs channel. And good, you're looking it up now. And this guy just pretends to be like a pretend like special agent trying to get people to return their carts to the cart corral in these large parking lots. And he's so comical. And the vast majority of the videos are just the ones that get escalated by the Karens of the world. And it's not just Karen, it's Karen in the generic sense, right? The super capital K. So it's, 40-year-old dudes or 25-year-old women and everywhere in between of all races who aren't returning their carts, and just get furious when he points out the fact that they're leaving their carts in a spot where a strong breeze can throw it against another car and leave a ding in it. And all he's trying to do is point it out. And it's amazing. to see day after day after day how angry people get. And like 30% of the videos, the person almost immediately says, I'm going to call the cops on you. So that's one of the categories that people call the cops on, right? So we're not, maybe we'll do a full episode.
And tying our previous crisis back into our current crisis, that was the reason, the stated reason why Governor Walz imposed what we call the Snitch Line, where if you observed people not observing social distancing or whatever we used to care about 2 months ago, we had a special state phone number for you to call, which earned up quite an amount of mockery, as it should. But the purpose for it was exactly this, that you weren't overwhelming your 911 operators with, Karening that, hey, I saw this guy that was putting his shopping cart, not in the corral or insufficiently in the corral, which was obviously was happening.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. And
this last few months does not paint a good picture of our trust and fellowship with our fellow man.
Yeah, so like annoying behavior is one of the reasons that often people will call the cops. And there's a handful of other ones that we don't need to enumerate. We'll get the link in the show notes. But there are going to be a bunch of these situations where people are going to need to call the police. And if they're gone, nothing's going to happen. And I have to point out that the Minnesota State Police already said, if you're not backing Minneapolis City Police, we're not going to come to your rescue.
Absolutely. And a number of other departments have said the same.
Which is exactly what we talked about last week, Mike, the power of the police politically to actually withhold the service to their public. I think both is scary at how powerful that is. And it's also a little bit horrifying that they would turn that kind of irresponsibility into political power for themselves. It's a little scary.
I look at that differently, as far as if, like, the one I saw this morning was the Anoka County Sheriff made a statement that, if the police department in Minneapolis is defunded, then we will not provide backup support, or I'm paraphrasing.
Right.
If I look at that as a perfectly reasonable response, that you are the Anoka County Sheriff's Department. It is not your job to primarily provide public safety for the residents of the city of Minneapolis. And if you can't rely on the local officers to provide that first line and give you direction, then we're not going to come in and do it for you. We're not familiar with the area. We're not geographically, close. We're not in.
Yeah.
So I look at that as a reasonable response.
Right. And I would love to see that particular language and reasoning behind some of these things. And the particular one that I saw didn't see that. It just came to me as like a position of solidarity with people that are in law enforcement. Not, look, what I'd like to hear these police departments and these law enforcement officials say is kind of what you just said, and in fact, actually express their interest in helping, but their inability to, because of the reasons that you listed. So if the statement were, we would love to come to the help of the city of Minneapolis, however, our officers are not trained or familiar with these things, and we don't have the resources to do that without putting our own citizens at risk, which is our primary job. Right. That's the message that I would like to hear, but I haven't seen that yet. And maybe it's been out there, I just haven't seen it.
And I don't know. I did, if you can see my screen here, we have another problem, Lou. The members, to quote Dr. Ian Malcolm, or to warp a quote by Dr. Ian Malcolm, the council members were so preoccupied with whether they should, they didn't stop to think if they could.
Mm-hmm.
And, not reported. And again, I would say this is a lapse not only of your understanding your role as a council member, and the media reporting it as though without any scrutiny that basically that we were going to just have an end to the Minneapolis Police Department. Well, what you're seeing here on the screen is the relevant section of the Minneapolis City Charter, and these are kind of funky instruments, so they don't exist for most cities in Minnesota. The charter is basically the constitution for the city. Most cities don't have these, but certain cities do, primarily but not exclusively cities that pre-existed the state. You can go to a charter, but it's more complicated. But basically what as applied here, what the kind of the relevant section is funding. And it says the city council must fund a police force of at least 0.0017 employees per resident and provide for those employees compensation for which purpose it may tax the taxable property in the city up to 0.3% of its value annually. This tax is an addition, blah, 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 blah. It also says in the first section that the mayor has complete power over the establishment and command of the police department. And both of these are kind of relevant to this conversation. I mean,
kind of.
It's entirely relevant to it.
Yeah.
And it goes to the question of like, and I was debating back and forth with a Minneapolis resident on this today who brought this to my attention, hat tip to Chris Kerwin, who discovered this little feature from apparently a friend who used to work in Minneapolis government and was befuddled why any reporter hadn't sort of dug this up yet. Can the council even do that? And the answer is no. If I were doing spin for Lisa Bender and her ilk, what I would say is what we will provide is going to be consistent with this charter, that we will have employees up to that 0.0017%. And I assume that some of those folks who have been schooled on the limits of their power will probably start to say things like that. But what the hell do I know? I mean, we're living in such bizarre times that maybe they're just going to try to run roughshod over the charter, which you can do. But you need one of two things to happen. You either need a unanimous vote of the council, not 9 of 13, but unanimous, and the mayor. So a total unanimous front, which it seems not to be likely. Or the charter commission, which is the sort of group of people who oversees the charter, has to call a vote of the people. And a majority of the people the residents, the voters in Minneapolis, have to support this an amendment to their charter.
Yeah. So I think, I think what I would like to ask all the lunatics to really do before you come out in support of defunding the police or abolishing police departments all over the place is start considering really the unintended consequences of not thinking all of this stuff through. Because there are really strong arguments that, redistributing some of this budget into different programs can fix a lot of these problems, but pretending that just moving $2 million from a police department into a social program is going to overnight reduce domestic violence is kind of preposterous. That's something that's going to take that kind of budget movement and application for perhaps an entire generation, not a year, not 2 years, maybe even not 6 or 7. You might start seeing some differences, but you're probably going to have to really start thinking about how those social programs really impact the lives of a 9-year-old right now in a tough socioeconomic position for when they have their own domestic partner. And, pretending that just moving that budget over right now does not solve the problem. And even just shuffling resources around and laying it on top does not matter. Like in the software world, which I live in, there's a joke about this sort of thing that often, executives within a software company will just try to throw resources at a problem to get it done faster. And the counter argument to that is just because you want to make a baby, you can't just get 9 women together and have them each do 1 month in the pregnancy and have it done in 1 month. This is a very analogous kind of situation. You can't just throw resources at a problem and get it done faster.
I can't think of an experience or an example, Lou, of where government has done anything other than throw money at a problem and expect for it to correct. It's well known that we have the second worst achievement gap between races, whites and people of color, and I think blacks in particular in Minnesota. Second only, I think, to Wisconsin. Way to go, Wisconsin! Always number one. If I'm wrong on that, I expect my Scotties to come in. But anyway, nonetheless, we're number 2, and we've known that for some time. And this, despite the fact that we spend more, which is a function of a lot of different things, but it's a function of society, being at certain societies being at a huge disadvantage, and we have spent generations already putting money behind those problems in terms of public schools, the disparity from what it costs to teach a child in Minneapolis versus, say, Jordan, and I'm not slighting that. I mean, maybe it should be more, but the point is, even if it is more, it's not working. And so throwing money at it is clearly not the issue. This is where I really question whether throwing a bunch of money on social programs, even after 30 or 40 years, is going to demonstrate any kind of a different result, because we haven't seen it in other aspects of society. I mean, not even in the slightest. If you look back at where we were in terms of spending on social programs in the early 1960s versus today, I mean, it is orders of magnitude higher. And I guess we haven't solved all these problems. And maybe they've gotten worse in certain areas. Maybe they've gotten better in certain areas, and we should measure that too. But
yeah, that's worth pointing out.
When people, I'll just finish on this point. When people say we want to have a conversation about these things, those are some of the things that people like me would want to have as part of that conversation. And yet that probably already has been interpreted as a racist statement by some. So
it's very hard right now to talk about some of the hard numbers that show that some of these things aren't necessarily working, or that just don't fit that narrative. And what's kind of shocking to me is, and it sucks because it is weaponized by the people who want to believe that this isn't a problem, where I think some well-meaning people, including you, and I'd like to throw myself in this too, that if you talk about those challenges and those deficiencies and either those programs or the data that don't support the narrative, you want to bring them up as a reason to say, hey, what we're doing right now is not working, or that maybe it's not nearly as bad as you think it is. So we need to readjust and identify the problem better. And I think one that I've noticed over the years, and I've never really brought up, and it's dangerous for me to even say this, is that there's a fair amount of data that the at least from the number of people dying at the hands of the police does not appear nationally to be disproportionately affecting Black people. I think it still does show like an overwhelming, horrible, disproportionate application to Hispanics. However, so there is that data, but one of the fascinating things, and I didn't get to fact check this.
By the way, offline went through some of that, and I'll put this in the, I don't know how, I'll ask you to put it in the show notes, Lou, because I don't know how to do it, but there's the Washington Post, so not rushlimbaugh.com, did a huge study on this, and you can't not at least look at that data and sort of say, now we're specifically talking about deaths, right? And so it's not to say that there's not racist behavior. It's not to say that there's not significant and societal, not police notwithstanding, issues with race in this country. And I think if we were having that conversation, you'd be kind of over here. But I've seen people who I know and trust and love in some cases going online and saying, this is a systematic extinction of certain people. And it's like, whoa. You know,
because I think where you're getting, and I think the number that I saw was it was literally 9 Black men were killed in all of 2019.
Yep.
And they were 9 unarmed men were killed by the police in 2019. And I think that number would surprise people if you were just to walk up to them and guess, particularly if you were to say how many compared whites to Blacks, what would those numbers look like? I think it would surprise a lot of people. And that's not to say that, like you said, anecdotally, I think it's pretty obvious that Black people are treated differently by the world. And it's pretty clear that it's,
I wouldn't say by the world. I would say by America. I would go that far.
You're right. My American what am I trying to say? Yeah, thank you. Has gotten the better of me. But the problem is that if you even try to bring this up to try to better approach the problem, it can put you in the camp of becoming and siding with super racist people who weaponize that to make their point that it's not a problem, because it is. But the nature of the problem might be a little bit different. So, and one of the reasons that I wanted to bring that up is specifically about how people are trying to approach the problem about defunding the police, because it's far more nuanced on this whole thing than people are immediately going to defund the police or abolish the police, which clearly police reform needs to happen. And the John Oliver, the entire episode goes into it in detail. But one of the points that I wanted to make, and I forgot to write down the other number, but I think it's something along the lines of, and you kind of hinted at it as you were talking, but this is nationwide. I'm talking about these numbers that don't seem to show this disproportionate narrative that people talk about. But there's pockets where it is happening. And Minneapolis seems to be like the worst. And we said it might be the second worst. And in fact, it was something like you're 9 times more likely to be beaten up by the police if you're black in Minneapolis than if you're white. But I want to say the other number that shocked me, and I didn't get to do a deep dive into where they got the stat, but 1 in 1,000 men in Minneapolis might expect to die at the hands of the police.
Wow. 1 of 1,000 men or black men?
1 in 1,000 black men in Minneapolis can expect to die at the hands of the police. And I don't know what the sample data was there. So, but that number shocked me. And I know John Oliver's team, like they have a huge research team. So I want to dig into that, and we'll include that in the show notes. But that is terrifying. So regardless of whether you want to,
absolutely, and that would makes me wonder how much of those national statistics are local in that sense. And
exactly.
By the way, and going back to, and I think we're kind of wrapping here, but going back to this defund the police argument, if what the council is saying is major systemic reforms to our police department, up to and including maybe be totally getting rid of the hierarchical structure, including the union and the leadership, and starting with something new, I don't know that this would have been a controversy, because almost everybody is on board with that.
Right.
I mean, then we're just discussing how. Then we're just discussing details, which I think literally almost everybody maybe not wearing a Minneapolis Police Department uniform, and probably a pretty significant portion of them, are ready to have that conversation.
Yeah, and I think that's been happening, right, gradually over the last couple of decades. And that's the reason that we see actual police brutality potentially at like an all-time low per capita. But when you see the horrifying worst of it, that's enough to continue to want to improve. The only challenge is that you need to do it probably gradually if you want to avoid unintended consequences, like people needing to call the cops on somebody who leaves their cart in the wrong place in a Target parking lot. So, yeah. Right. Well, this is a bigger issue. We just had a very limited amount of time to get ready for this. We have to end the show a little bit early today, but we're going to address this as we did with qualified immunity last week. Watch Last Week Tonight on YouTube for free, or lots of streaming services. We're going to put other videos in the show notes, including some links that Mike mentioned. And we wanted to address some other things, but I think it's going to have to wait for our favorite show of the week, which is tomorrow, Lose Day.
It's Lose Day.
And I want to point out, it's Lose Day Eve. So I want to point out too that we're available now on YouTube. So look for Hotlou Happy Hour on YouTube. We're streaming live over there, or you can watch the replays there. Also available on my Twitter at hotlou. And promise the podcast is coming. it is coming. But so we got to wrap a little bit early today. Did you need to throw in anything else, Mike?
No, other than it doesn't happen all that often, but there's a podcast other than this one. Never mind, we don't have a podcast yet, but there's a show other than this one that I've been getting into lately. It's by the Dispatch, which is I've discussed them before. They're center right, but they're more libertarian leaning. Anyway, they had a show yesterday with Jane Coaston on it, who's a senior politics reporter at Vox, and literally for an hour, she sort of broke this issue down from a very libertarian perspective, kind of from the perspective of state power, not necessarily systematic racism. And I had no idea where she was even coming from politically, which was really refreshing. She was even introduced as the reporter covering conservatism for Vox, which doesn't mean she's a conservative. But at any rate, I could sort of sniff out certain leanings. But what actually kind of caused me to want to stop and re-listen to the whole thing was at the very end, she was asked about a tweet she put out where she relayed a horrific experience from her own life from when she was a 14-year-old mixed race girl in rural Ohio. And it just it was like the needle scratch, where it gets to this point of systemic racism is such a bigger deal than just police behavior. And police behavior is such a bigger deal than racism, or at least it's not ipso facto, they're not necessarily causative, at least in the same way that I think a lot of people over the past week or two have been inappropriately or unfortunately linking. And from the perspective of a young mixed race Black woman, it was really, in retrospect, that's why I want to go back and listen to it all again. It was like, when you watch the movie The Sixth Sense, you watch it differently, knowing what you know about the end. Spoiler alert, it's been 20 plus years. I can use that reference. And
Bruce Willis is dead.
I listened to this whole interview with Jane Coaston, and I've since followed her on Twitter, not knowing she was a mixed race woman, not knowing her politics, not knowing a thing about it other than what she was presenting as sort of evidence on misuse of state power, sort of writ large, and then as applied to police. And there was some great examples in there. So I will recommend that to the lunatics as well. It's the Dispatch podcast. It's free. Jane Coaston, you can follow her at CJane87 on Twitter.
We'll throw that in the show notes too. And I want to point out too, as I've done a couple times on this show, and I got a phone call on Friday specifically for somebody to just have a conversation with me, because they said to me they didn't know that I'm mixed race. You look at my skin, especially washed out with my circadian optics bright light therapy lamp here, I could not be more white. However, if you were to meet my dad, you could not confuse him for anything but Native American. Right. So between his voice, his accent, and his skin color, you could not mistake that. So, I'll admit that sometimes I use that as a little bit of a trap when I get in these conversations, because people don't know that I have, in small part, been a victim of racism, and my dad has been, not to the level that George Floyd has, or I'm sure Black Americans have, but man.
You've been a victim of racism from me.
That is accurate. Maybe not as much as my freshman year roommate, however. Okay. With that, we're going to wrap up Hotlou Happy Hour today, but the show notes are going to be amazing. Check us out on YouTube, or if you want to follow on Twitter, and soon we'll have a podcast, but you can always check out the notes at Hotlou Happy Hour, hotlou.com/happy hour. And we're going to tackle more on this point, I'm sure, as we have a little bit already with the qualified immunity episode we did last week. And you can expect the next several weeks to talk about this on what is now fully converted into Hotlou News Network. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in to today's Hotlou Happy Hour. I'm your host, Hotlou.
I am looking forward to getting back to sports, Mike Franklin.
And we'll talk to you on Lose Day.